He didn't even look up when she walked in. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the money. Not what happened after. Just that moment, a woman in her 60s, still wearing her gray uniform from a 12-hour shift, standing in the doorway of a room full of people who made more in a week than she had in 30 years of cleaning their floors. And the man at the center of it all didn't even glance up from his drink. Her name was Nora Tillman. She had worked for the Caldwell family for 11 years, cooked their breakfasts, scrubbed their bathrooms, pressed their tablecloths for dinner parties. She was never invited to stay and watch. And on this particular Friday evening in late October, she had come to collect her pay envelope from Mrs. Caldwell's study, the same thing she did the last Friday of every month, and she had walked past the open doors of the grand living room, where Arthur Caldwell was hosting what he called a gathering, and what everyone else called a chance for Arthur to remind people how much smarter he was than them. Nora didn't stop. She never stopped. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way through a room like was in a straight line, eyes down, quiet feet. But someone saw her. Nora. Arthur's voice cut across the room. Not loud. He never had to be loud. Come in for a moment. She stopped. She turned. She stepped into the room because you didn't say no to Arthur Caldwell. Not if you wanted to keep your job. Not if you needed that envelope at the end of the month. Arthur Caldwell was 63 years old. He had built his money in commercial real estate, made more of it in private equity, and spent the last decade making sure every person within a 5-mile radius knew both of those things. He was the kind of man who interrupted people mid-sentence, not because he was rude, though he was, but because he genuinely believed his version of whatever you were saying was more accurate than yours. He gestured toward Nora with his glass. "This is Nora," he said to the room. "She's been keeping this house running for over a decade." He said it the way you might describe a reliable appliance. "Nora, we're doing something interesting tonight. A little competition. You're welcome to watch if you'd like." Nora nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." She had no intention of watching. She just wanted her envelope. But then Arthur said something else. "Actually, your son is the one who repairs things around here, isn't he? Comes in on weekends? Does the odd jobs?" "Yes, sir," she said carefully. "That's Malcolm. How old is he now?" Arthur smiled. 51. He turned back to his guests like he'd just made a point. Remarkable. A grown man, 51 years old, spending his Saturdays fixing gutters. A few people chuckled. Not all of them, but enough. Nora said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. What she didn't say was this. Malcolm Tillman had spent 22 years as a structural engineer, had built bridges, had consulted on 3 international infrastructure projects, one of them in West Africa, one in Southeast Asia, had won an award in 2009 that sat in a shadow box in her living room, the kind of award that came with a handshake from a state governor, had given all of it up 4 years ago to move back to Clover Hill, Alabama, to be close to her after her hip surgery, to help her through the recovery, to make sure she wasn't alone in that house while she healed. He fixed gutters on Saturdays because she asked him to, and because he liked working with his hands, and because Arthur Caldwell's gutters genuinely needed fixing. But Nora didn't say any of that. She just smiled the way she had been smiling in rooms like this one for 40 years, patient, small, unbothered, and she waited for Arthur to lose interest in her. He didn't. "What does Malcolm do the rest of the week?" Arthur asked. "Does he work?" "He consults," Nora said. "Engineering. Arthur tilted his head. "What kind? Structural?" A pause. "Self-employed?" Arthur asked. The way he said it, you'd think self-employed was a polite way of saying unemployed. "He has clients," Nora said. "He's selective about the work he takes." Arthur nodded slowly. "Right." And then, almost like it was an afterthought, "We're doing a bridge design challenge tonight. For fun. Nothing serious. A few of my colleagues from the firm, we've been debating a project for months, and tonight we thought we'd each pitch a solution. Informal. But I'll tell you what, Nora. Why don't you call Malcolm? Invite him over. Let him take a look. See how he holds up against this crowd." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not uncomfortable, more like the way a crowd goes quiet before a magician does something they think they already know the ending to. Nora looked at Arthur Caldwell. She measured the invitation. She had been around long enough to recognize the difference between a genuine welcome and a setup dressed up in friendly language. This was a setup. She knew that. She knew it the way she knew weather, not from looking at a forecast, but from how the air felt. And she called Malcolm anyway. He arrived 40 minutes later. He knocked on the front door, not the side door. The front door, and when the housekeeper answered and looked uncertain, Nora walked over and said simply, "He's with me." Malcolm Tillman was not a large man. He was average height, lean, with close-cut gray at his temples and reading glasses tucked into the pocket of his shirt. He was wearing the same thing he'd been wearing when she called. Dark jeans, a blue Henley, work boots with dried clay on the left one. He had not changed. He hadn't thought it necessary. He looked around the room once, the way a person looks at a room they're assessing for load-bearing capacity. Quick, systematic, not unkind. "Mom," he said. "Baby," she said. Arthur Caldwell crossed the room with his hand extended. "Malcolm, glad you could make it. I've heard a lot about you." Malcolm shook his hand. "I haven't heard much about you," he said, and he said it pleasantly, without apology, and Arthur Caldwell laughed because he didn't quite know what to do with it. "Your mother tells me you do structural engineering," Arthur said. "That's right. Anything I'd know." Malcolm considered. "Probably not," he said. "Most of my work isn't visible from the outside." Arthur introduced him to the room. 6 other men, all of them well-dressed, all of them with the careful posture of people who went to schools that cost a lot and never quite let you forget it. There was a project architect named Sutton, a developer named Price, 2 partners from Arthur's firm whose names Malcolm immediately forgot because they introduced themselves with their job titles before their names, and Malcolm had never been good at remembering titles. The challenge was this: a footbridge project, a real one, a pedestrian crossing over a narrow gorge in a state park about 60 miles north of Clover Hill. Arthur's firm had been retained to consult. They had been arguing for months about the approach. Tonight was supposed to be a friendly debate, each man pitching his preferred solution, arguing his case, defending his math. Arthur had set up a projection screen at one end of the room. There were printed diagrams on the coffee table. Someone had brought a scale model, foam core, and balsa wood that looked like it had taken real effort. Malcolm picked it up and studied it without being invited to. "This the site?" he asked. "Replica," said the architect Sutton. "We scaled it from the survey data." Malcolm turned it in his hands. He looked at the gorge, he looked at the span, he looked at where they'd positioned the anchor points on the model. He set it down gently. "Who did the soil analysis?" he asked. Sutton blinked. "We used the county survey. Which year?" A pause. "I'd have to check," Sutton said. "The county updated that corridor in 2019, Malcolm said, still looking at the model. There was a slide event on the eastern face in 2018. Small one, didn't make the news, but it changed the subsurface profile. If you're anchoring on that side, you want the updated data." The room was quiet. Arthur recovered first. "That's interesting," he said, in the tone of a man who finds something far less interesting than he's pretending to. "But I think for tonight's purposes, we're working with what we have. The point is the design approach, not the geology." "With respect," Malcolm said, and he said it without looking up, "the design approach is the geology. You can't separate them." The man named Price laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your mother's son," he said, and glanced at Arthur like they were sharing something. Malcolm looked at him. Just looked at him. Price stopped laughing. "Let me see the span measurements," Malcolm said. They gave him the measurements because nobody wanted to be the one who didn't. He stood at the projection screen with a printed diagram and a pen he'd borrowed from the architect, and he walked through the problem the way he always did. Quietly, without performance, in the specific language of a man who had spent 2 decades solving exactly this kind of thing. He talked about load distribution. He talked about seasonal expansion, and the way temperature changes in Alabama hill country stressed different materials differently than they did in flatland. He talked about why suspension was the wrong answer for this particular gorge. Not wrong everywhere, but wrong here. Wrong for the soil profile. Wrong for the maintenance budget a state park could realistically sustain. He talked about a cantilevered through truss design he had used on a project in 2011, modified for shorter span, and why it would outlast anything else they were considering by 30 years. He drew on the back of someone's printed diagram. He used a paper plate at one point, which made Nora press her lips together to keep from smiling. Nobody interrupted him. That was the thing she noticed. In this room, in this house with these men, nobody interrupted Malcolm. Not once. Not even Arthur, who interrupted everyone as a matter of principle. When Malcolm finished, he capped the pen and handed it back to the architect. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Sutton said, "The 2019 survey. You said you knew about the slide event. Were you on that corridor?" "I was," Malcolm said. "I was brought in by the county for the assessment. 3 months. We wrote the updated report." Sutton stared at him. "You wrote the updated county survey," he said. "Part of it," Malcolm said. "There were 4 of us." Arthur Caldwell had not moved from his position near the fireplace. He had his drink. He had his expression, which was the expression of a man recalibrating something privately and not enjoying the process. "You could have led with that," Arthur said. "I could have," Malcolm agreed. He picked up his mother's pay envelope from the side table where she'd set it down when she came in. He handed it to her. "You should have started with the geology." Later, after the guests had gone and the catering staff was clearing the remains of the evening, Arthur found Nora in the kitchen doorway pulling on her coat. "Your son," he said. She waited. "He's the real thing," Arthur said. It came out sounding like something had cost him to say it. "Yes," Nora said. "He is." Arthur looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Why didn't you ever say anything all these years?" Nora considered that question. She had considered versions of it her whole life. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you make sure they knew? "You never asked," she said simply. She pulled her coat closed and walked out into the cool October night. Malcolm was leaning against the car, looking up at the sky. He did that sometimes, looked up at the sky the way engineers looked at structures, like he was calculating something invisible. "You good?" he asked. "I'm good," she said. They drove home with the radio off. Neither of them needed to say anything. There was nothing left to say that the evening hadn't already said for them. But that wasn't the end of it. That was never the end of it. 2 weeks later, Arthur Caldwell called Nora's cell phone. He had never called her cell phone before. He had the number because she'd given it to Mrs. Caldwell years ago in case of emergencies, and until this moment she had not considered that Arthur might one day decide her phone number constituted a personal contact. "I'd like to speak with Malcolm," he said. "If that's all right." She gave him the number. Malcolm called her afterward. "He wants to bring me on the footbridge project," he said, as lead consultant. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it, and I'm thinking about it." He thought about it for 4 days. He called her twice during those 4 days, not to talk about Arthur or the project, but because that was what they did. They called each other. They talked about the garden and about her neighbor Mrs. Pickett's dog that kept getting into her tomatoes and about the weather rolling in from the Gulf. And then at the end of each call, right before they hung up, one of them would circle back and they'd talk about the bridge. On the 4th day, he called and said, "I'm going to do it. But I set my terms." "What terms?" "My rate," he said. "Full rate. Not the courtesy discount. Not the favor rate. The actual number." She said nothing. "And I told him," Malcolm continued, "that I work with my own team, my people. Nobody gets slotted in because they're connected to somebody. We pick based on qualifications." What did he say? He said yes. She sat down in her kitchen chair. Outside, the last light of the afternoon was coming through the window and landing on the table in a long gold stripe. She looked at it for a moment. "Malcolm," she said. "Yeah, that award. The 2009 one. The one in the box. What about it? You ever think about putting it out somewhere? In the living room, maybe, where people could see it." A pause. She could hear him smiling. "It's in the living room," he said. "I mean somewhere more visible." "Mom." He laughed. The real laugh, not the polite one, not the professional one, the one that sounded exactly like his father's. "I know where it is. It doesn't need to be more visible. I know what I did." She pressed her hand flat on the table. The gold light moved. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I knew." The footbridge opened the following spring. It was a small ceremony. State park officials, a few local representatives, a reporter from the regional paper who wrote 6 paragraphs and spelled Malcolm's last name wrong. There was a ribbon. There was a photograph. Arthur Caldwell was there. He stood to Malcolm's left in the photograph, and he shook Malcolm's hand for the camera. And he said, in his speech to the small crowd gathered on the trailhead, that this bridge represented the best of what collaborative expertise can achieve. He did not mention that he had once introduced Malcolm's mother to a roomful of people as the woman who kept his house running. He did not mention the Friday evening, the pay envelope, the paper plate diagram. Malcolm did not mention it either. But Nora was there. She had driven up herself, in her own car, wearing a yellow blouse she'd bought specifically for the occasion. And she stood at the back of the small crowd while they cut the ribbon, and she watched her son walk out onto the bridge he had designed, and she felt the bridge hold. It held the way she had always known it would, solid, quiet, built to last. A woman standing near her said, "Do you know him, the engineer?" Nora looked at Malcolm standing at the center of the bridge, looking down at the gorge, one hand on the railing. "Yes," she said. "He's mine." I think about Nora sometimes when I hear people talk about humility like it's a weakness. Like staying quiet means you don't know your own worth. Like not announcing yourself means you have nothing worth announcing. Nora Tillman walked through rooms she wasn't invited to stay in for 40 years. She cooked food she didn't eat, cleaned floors she didn't walk on, and raised a son who built things that will outlast every person who ever made her feel small. She never demanded recognition. She never asked Arthur Caldwell to see her differently. She just lived the life she had, honestly, steadily, without apology. And when the moment came, it spoke without her having to raise her voice. Malcolm didn't walk into that room to prove anything. He walked in because his mother called. He spoke up because the work required it. He named his rate because that was what the work was worth. That's not revenge. That's not a comeback story. That's just what it looks like when someone knows exactly who they are and has always known and never needed your validation to keep going. I want to ask you something before you go. Think about the person in your life. Maybe it was a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone who worked quietly behind the scenes for you, who never made you feel like a burden, even when you were, who showed up consistently without fanfare, who you maybe didn't thank the way they deserved. That person is Nora. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Tell me about someone like that in your own life. I read every single one, and if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we tell stories like this every week on Carter Tales. Real people, real weight, real moments that matter. We'll see you in the next one.